So if you were to guess, like, who the best-selling poets in human history are, just off the top of your head.
Right. I mean, most people would probably jump straight to Shakespeare.
Yeah, Shakespeare is definitely up there. And Lao Tzu is another big one. But who do you think is the third?
It's a tough one.
It is, because if you're just guessing, you might say Homer or, I don't know, maybe Walt Whitman or Maya Angelou.
Dante is usually a popular guess, too.
Right, Dante. But you would be wrong. All of those are wrong. Because the answer is actually a man who the academic elite of his day openly mocked.
Yeah, they really did.
They hated him. And a man who privately confessed to his friends that he felt like a complete fraud. But he wrote a book that has sold over 100 million copies.
Which is just a staggering number.
It's unbelievable. Over 100 million copies, translated into more than 100 languages. And it essentially serves as the foundational text for, like, modern spirituality without religion. So, welcome to the Deep Dive. We are so thrilled you're here with us today.
We really are.
If you're a curious mind, a lifelong learner, you are in the exact right place. Because our mission today is massive. We are unpacking Kahlil Gibran's 1923 masterpiece, The Prophet.
It's just this profound mystery of the literary world, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at a text that functions almost like a mirror for the human soul.
Yeah, a mirror is a great way to put it.
Because it's been this quiet, constant companion to millions of people in their most intimate and vulnerable moments. And when you look at the source material we've gathered for this deep dive...
Which is extensive, by the way.
Very. We've got academic analyses of its linguistic universality, historical essays from JSTOR about its cultural impact, linguistic breakdowns of its poetic structure, and of course the actual text itself.
Right.
And through all that, you start to see a picture of an author who achieves something almost impossible. I mean, he synthesized the wisdom of the East and the West, all while struggling with some incredibly deep personal demons.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the start. Because those numbers I mentioned, they are just staggering. Third best-selling poet in history.
Yeah.
But if you look at the academic establishment, especially during his lifetime and, shortly after, they completely dismissed him.
Oh, they brushed him off entirely.
They called his work naive. They called it sentimental.
Yeah.
I think they explicitly said it wasn't, quote, real literature.
That's exactly right.
So my immediate question is just how? How does a book become one of the most widely read pieces of writing in human history while the literal gatekeepers of literature are actively turning up their noses at it?
To understand that paradox, we really have to look at the astonishing origins of this whole phenomenon. Because the book was published exactly a century ago, in September 1923.
Right.
And it was published by Alfred A. Knopf. Now, Knopf, to his credit, agreed to publish it. But he didn't exactly throw the weight of his marketing department behind it.
Not at all.
No. In fact, he famously admitted later that he hadn't met 5 people who had ever actually read Gibran. So because of that skepticism, the initial print run was incredibly modest. They only printed about 1,200 copies.
Wait, 1,200? That's...
barely anything.
Yeah, when you consider it goes on to sell 100 million. 1,200 copies for a national book release is a microscopic drop in the bucket. It's basically nothing.
It is a blip. But here's where the story gets remarkable. Those 1,200 copies sold out in a month.
Wow.
And I want to be super clear about why they sold out. Because it wasn't because of some massive advertising campaign or, glowing front page reviews in the New York Times.
Because the reviews are kind of bad.
Very mixed.
Yeah.
And very sparse. No, it sold out because of the most powerful, uncontrollable marketing tool in existence. Word of mouth.
The holy grail of marketing.
Exactly. People read it, they were deeply emotionally moved by it, and they physically handed their copy to someone else and just said, you have to read this.
It's the ultimate grassroots success story. Because you don't hand a book to a friend unless it articulated something that, you couldn't figure out how to say yourself.
Precisely.
And this wasn't just a flash in the pan either. It didn't just have a good year and then fade away. The cultural wave just kept building decade after decade, adapting to whatever crisis the world was facing at the time.
That's exactly what our sources trace, this remarkable trajectory.
Okay.
So by the time of the Great Depression in 1938, which is a time when people were desperate for meaning, comfort, some assurance that their suffering wasn't for nothing, it was selling 100,000 copies.
Unbelievable.
And then the world plunges into World War II. And what happens? The military actually distributed it to soldiers overseas.
I found this part fascinating.
Yeah, they printed these little pocket-sized armed services editions.
Just pause and imagine that for a second. You have soldiers in the muddy, freezing trenches of Europe, surrounded by just death and total chaos. And inside their uniform pocket, they are carrying this tiny book of poetic philosophy about love and peace and the soul.
It's a striking image.
Why would the military choose that specific book for a war zone?
Because it speaks to the core of human resilience. It provided solace in the face of absolute economic ruin during the Depression, and then it provided spiritual grounding in the face of global industrialized violence. It's just an incredibly versatile text.
Right.
But its true cultural apogee-like, its absolute peak of cultural saturation arrived a bit later. In the 1960s, during the counterculture movement,
The hippie era.
during that era, the Prophet was selling an astonishing 5,000 copies a week in the United States alone.
5,000 a week. That is wild. But it makes sense. In the 60s, you had an entire generation that was questioning authority. They were rejecting traditional religious institutions, rebelling against their parents' churches. But, and this is key, they were still starving for some kind of spiritual nourishment.
Exactly. And Gibran steps right into that void. He became an alternative to the Bible for that generation, a sacred text for the unchurched, essentially. But this brings us right back to that academic disconnect you mentioned earlier. Because while all this word-of-mouth explosion is happening, while soldiers are reading it in foxholes and hippies are reading it at Woodstock, what are the literary critics doing? Well, according to the J.S. Tor analysis in our sources, they hated it.
I don't get that. I mean, if millions of people are moved to tears by a book, how can the people whose literal job it is to study books say it has no value? What was their main problem with it?
Well, to understand their disdain, you have to look at the literary context of the early 1920s. This was the era of high modernism.
Right.
And if you aren't familiar with that term, just think about what was happening in the world. World War I had just completely shattered the global psyche. The old rules of society felt like a lie. So the art of that era reflected that brokenness. In 1922, just a year before The Prophet, T.S. Eliot publishes The Wasteland.
Okay, yeah.
James Joyce publishes Ulysses.
I remember trying to read The Wasteland in college. It is incredibly difficult.
It's brutal.
It jumps around. It references all this obscure mythology in like multiple different languages. You practically need a separate glossary just to understand what he's talking about on page 1.
Exactly. But that was what the academic elite valued at the time. They valued complexity, obscurity, fragmentation. They believed that because the modern world was chaotic and fractured, art needed to be chaotic and fractured to be, true.
They wanted intellectual puzzles.
Yes. And then into this highly cynical, highly intellectual environment strolls Kahlil Gibran.
With his little book.
And he is writing earnest, straightforward, faux biblical poetry. He uses aphorisms, these short, memorable truths. He is writing openly about love and joy and the soul without a single hint of irony.
He wasn't trying to be clever. He was just trying to be true.
And to the modernist critics, that wasn't just bad writing, it was literary heresy. They called his work retrograde. They called it florid and extravagantly overwritten. They viewed it as a naive step backward into 19th century romanticism. They just felt it was entirely out of step with this serious, cynical, modern artistic project.
I can't help but draw a parallel to what we see happening right now today.
How so?
Well, think about the digital era of poetry. Someone like Rupi Kaur, in fact, our sources mention that Rupi Kaur actually wrote the foreword for a modern 2019 Penguin edition of The Prophet.
She did, yeah.
Which is such a perfect pairing because you have these poets today who completely bypass traditional literary magazines. They don't care if the New Yorker publishes them.
Right.
They post directly to Instagram or TikTok. They speak very plainly about raw emotion, trauma, healing, and they amass millions of devoted followers. And what does the academic establishment do? They roll their eyes and say, well, that's not real poetry.
It's the exact same dynamic.
It really is. It sounds like Gibran was basically the original viral indie author doing exactly this 100 years before the internet even existed.
That is a profound and highly accurate analogy. In fact, the global modern literature scholar Arthi Vadi points this out explicitly in our sources. She says the success of popular poets in the digital sphere is functionally equivalent to the word-of-mouth success of The Prophet.
Oh, really?
Yes, because it operates entirely outside the professional literary circles that usually dictate prestige. Vade notes that while traditional novelists might strive to entertain or, challenge intellectually, these popular poets aim to inspire. They're providing a service to the reader's emotional well-being.
They aren't trying to impress other writers. They're trying to heal the reader.
Precisely. Gibran proved that there is more than one way for poetry to have meaning, and more than one way for it to reach an audience. He achieved a kind of democratic virality. He bypassed the gatekeepers because the public decided they needed his words.
But that leads me to the obvious question, why him? Why did this specific book, written by this specific guy, resonate with so many different types of people? Because if you just read the quotes out of context, it sounds incredibly serene. It sounds like it was written by an ancient guru sitting perfectly still on a mountaintop who just has everything figured out.
And that is the great illusion of the prophet.
Okay, unpack that.
To understand the book's universal appeal, we have to look deeply at the man who wrote it. Because that serenity, that omniscient wisdom of the text, is in many ways a beautifully constructed mask.
Oh, mask.
Yes. To understand why this book speaks to millions of people who feel lost or anxious or who are seeking something, you have to understand the profound alienation of Kahlil Gibran himself. He was not a man floating on a cloud of constant enlightenment. He was a man in deep, agonizing personal conflict.
This is the part of the research that completely changed how I view the book.
It's fascinating.
We are dealing with a man who is described by one scholar in our sources as being, quote, thrice alienated. So if you're listening to this and you've ever felt like you don't quite belong anywhere, whether that's in your family, in your town, in your career, Gibran's life is going to really resonate with you.
Absolutely.
Let's introduce his origins. Gibran was born in 1883 in a mountainous town called Bukhari in Lebanon. And at the time, this area was part of the Ottoman Empire. He was raised as a Maronite Christian.
Which is an important detail to clarify for context. Maronite Christianity is an Eastern Catholic Church. It is in full communion with the Pope in Rome, but it has its own distinct heritage, its own liturgy, and deeply ingrained monastic traditions anchored right there in the mountains of Lebanon.
Right.
But Lebanon itself is a historic crossroads of civilizations. So even as a young boy, Gibran was exposed to a really rich tapestry of beliefs. He was surrounded by Islamic traditions, and particularly the mysticism of Sufism.
Let's do a quick explainer on Sufism for anyone who might not be familiar, because it heavily influences his writing later on. How does Sufism differ from, say, Orthodox Islam?
Broadly speaking, Sufism is the mystical inward path of Islam, where Orthodox religion might focus heavily on outward laws, rituals, and the structured adherence to Scripture. Sufism focuses on the direct, personal, and often ecstatic experience of the divine.
Like a personal connection.
Exactly. It's about purifying the heart to experience God's love directly, often through poetry, music, and contemplation. It seeks to dissolve the ego so that only the divine remains. You can immediately see how a young Gibran, absorbing this atmosphere alongside his Christian upbringing, would begin to form a very fluid, boundaryless view of spirituality.
Absolutely. So he's getting this incredible spiritual education just from his environment, but his actual home life was a nightmare.
It was very dark.
His father was a tax collector, but he was also a notoriously violent, abusive alcoholic. And the father eventually goes to prison for embezzlement, and the authorities confiscate the family's property, leaving them in total poverty.
It's just destitute.
So when Gibran was 12 years old, his mother made the incredibly brave, desperate decision to take Gibran and his siblings and emigrate to the United States. She essentially fled, leaving the abusive father behind in Lebanon. And they arrived in America and settled in the immigrant districts of Boston's South End in 1895.
You really have to place yourself in his shoes to grasp the psychological impact of this move.
Right. Just imagine being 12 years old. You leave the beautiful ancient cedar forests of the Lebanese mountains, a place steeped in centuries of history and quiet majesty, and you are suddenly dropped into the gritty, bustling, impoverished, smog-filled immigrant slums of late 19th century Boston.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
You don't speak the language. You are a Christian from a Muslim-majority region, living in an American city dominated by Irish and Italian immigrants, where you are seen as an absolute exotic outsider. The culture shock must have been physically painful.
It was profoundly disorienting for him. He was completely unmoored. But Gibran was a uniquely talented boy. He was dreamy, deeply sensitive, and clearly a gifted artist and writer.
Right, he was sketching and drawing.
Yes, and as he grew up in Boston, his artistic talents began to catch the attention of social workers and eventually the bohemian avant-garde circles of the city. Wealthy patrons of the arts took an interest in him.
But this is where it gets a little weird.
It does. Here is where the JS score analysis reveals something critical and somewhat dark about his psychological development. These Western patrons in Boston, and later when he moved to New York, didn't just see a talented immigrant kid trying to find his way. They projected a very specific Orientalist identity onto him.
Meaning they treated him like a prop.
Essentially, yes.
They looked at this young Lebanese artist and decided, you are the mystical sage from the East. They actually dressed him up in robes for portraits.
They did.
They exoticized him. They basically cast him in a play he didn't ask to be in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Long before he ever wrote a word of the prophet, they treated him as a ready-made Eastern mystic. And when you are a young person, especially a traumatized immigrant who's desperate to find footing, approval, and financial support in a strange land, and powerful, wealthy people tell you who you are,
You internalize it.
you do. You tend to internalize it.
You play the part to survive.
Yes. He internalized this philosopher, poet, priest image that his patrons projected onto him. It became an inseparable part of his public persona. But living that projection, wearing a mask that isn't entirely yours, comes with a terrible psychological cost. It further complicated his relationship with his own Arabic and Lebanese heritage. He was performing an identity that was actually a Western fantasy of what the East was supposed to be.
Which leads to a detail from the sources that honestly broke my heart. This man, whose words have brought peace to hundreds of millions of people, secretly suffered from crippling imposter syndrome.
It's tragic.
He was terrified people would find out he wasn't the enlightened guru they thought he was. He once confided to a close friend in a letter, and this is a direct quote, "I'm a false alarm."
Wow.
He felt like a fraud.
The inner turmoil was immense. He was constantly trying to reconcile these fractured parts of his identity. He was the Lebanese boy from the mountains. He was the American immigrant in the slums. He was the Maronite Christian. He was the admirer of Sufi mysticism. He was the darling of the Boston bohemian scene.
That is a lot of identities for one person to carry.
The pressure of holding all those conflicting identities together was crushing. And tragically, much like his father, he turned to alcohol to manage that immense internal pressure.
Generational trauma rearing its head.
Yes. He spent long, lonely hours in his New York studio, a place he ironically called his hermitage. He would paint, he would write, and he would drink heavily. It ultimately destroyed his physical health. He died in 1931 at the very young age of 48 from cirrhosis of the liver, driven entirely by his alcoholism.
It's such a tragic end for a man who gave the world so much light. But his physical legacy, like what actually happened after his death, is a perfect poetic reflection of this dual identity. It's the story of a man physically torn between two worlds.
It really is.
Though he lived his adult life in New York, his final resting place is back where he started. Our sources detailed the Gibran Museum, which is in his native town of Brachari in Lebanon. But it's not a normal museum building. It's housed in the Mar Sarkis Hermitage, which is an actual 7th century monk grotto carved straight into the rock of the mountain.
Yes, his sister Mariana purchased the hermitage at his request before he died. After his death in New York, his mortal remains were shipped all the way back across the world to Lebanon to be entombed in this ancient grotto. But what makes it so incredibly poignant is what they shipped back with him. They didn't just send his body.
Right.
They shipped the entire contents of his New York studio.
Everything. His furniture, his personal belongings, his private library of Western literature, his notebooks, and 440 of his original paintings. So if you visit this place today, you walk into an ancient 7th century Lebanese monastic cave, and it is filled with the velvet chairs and the bohemian trappings of a 1920s New York artist.
It's surreal.
It is the ultimate physical manifestation of a man who never fully belonged to either world.
It is a striking visual of his internal reality. And out of that intense feeling of not belonging anywhere, of being a perpetual exile, Gibran created the character of Almustafa. And this brings us to the actual narrative framework of the prophet.
Right, because it's not just a list of rules, there's a story happening.
Exactly. The framing device of the book is brilliant because it perfectly mirrors Gibran's own life of exile. Almustafa is a prophet, a wise man, who has been living in the foreign city of Orphalese for 12 years.
And what has he been doing for 12 years?
He has been waiting for a ship to finally arrive and take him back to the isle of his birth.
So he's an immigrant. He's an exile, just like Gibran. And the book begins at the very moment of departure. The ship has finally arrived in the harbor. Almustafa is walking down to the docks, preparing to leave this city where he has lived for over a decade. And the people of the city, who have come to deeply love and revere him, realize he is leaving forever.
I don't want him to go.
No, they gather around him in the town square and basically beg him, before you leave us, Impart your final wisdom. Tell us the truth about life.
It is a moment of profound transition. It places the entire book in a liminal space, the space between staying and going, between life and memory. There is an urgency to the text because he is about to step onto a boat and vanish. And the very first person to step forward from the crowd to ask him a question is a seeress named Elmitra. And she asks him about the most fundamental, universal human experience. She asks him to speak of love.
I want to dive deep into this specific section because the language he uses here is absolutely not what you might expect if you've only ever seen this book quoted on throw pillows or like inspirational greeting cards.
It's far from it.
We tend to think of Gibran as dispensing sweet, soft platitudes. But this is intense. When asked about love, Almustafa doesn't offer comfort. The linguistic analysis in our sources points out that Gibran immediately personifies love as a commanding, violent, almost terrifying entity.
Yes, the imagery is stark. He doesn't describe love as a warm feeling. He describes it as an active, relentless force.
I want you to listen to these lines. Imagine asking a wise man about love, hoping for something sweet, and he looks at you and says this. Like sheaves of corn, he gathers you unto himself. He threshes you to make you naked. He sifts you to free you from your husks. He grinds you to whiteness. He kneads you until you are pliant. And then he assigns you to a sacred fire that you may become sacred bread for God's sacred feast.
The agricultural metaphors here are incredibly deliberate, and they are powerful. Gibran is comparing the psychological experience of true love to the violent, transformative process of harvesting wheat and turning it into bread.
It sounds painful.
Think about the physical actions happening here. Love gathers, it threshes, which means beating the grain to separate it. It sifts, it grinds, it kneads, and finally it burns in a fire. It is an act of total, uncompromising deconstruction. The husk that he talks about freeing you from is the ego. It is the defensive shell you build around yourself. He is saying that the process of love is not comfortable. It is a purifying ordeal.
I genuinely have to ask you about this because it feels so contrary to how we talk about love today. Today we talk about love as something that should make you feel safe, secure, and happy. But Gibran is frightening.
He is.
He explicitly says elsewhere in the passage that love has a sword hidden among his pinions that may wound you. He says, even as love crowns you, so shall he crucify you. Why on earth is love portrayed as something that both crowns and crucifies? Why this aggressive duality of violence and yielding? If millions of people found comfort in this book, why does the very first chapter tell them love is going to destroy them?
Because Gibran is speaking to a deeper truth that superficial definitions of love avoid. Drawing deeply from those mystic traditions we mentioned earlier, like Sufism, Gibran understands that true love, whether we're talking about romantic love for a partner or spiritual love for the divine, requires the absolute annihilation of the selfish ego.
You can't stay who you were.
Precisely. You cannot remain your isolated, protected, defended self and truly experience love. You have to let your walls be torn down. The crucifixion he speaks of is the death of your selfishness. The sword that wounds you is the painful realization of your own vulnerabilities and flaws that love inevitably exposes.
That makes a lot of sense.
The source analysis points out that Gibran views love not as a transaction between two people, I give you this, you give me that, but as a universal force that acts upon you. You do not possess love. Love possesses you. As he writes, love has no other desire but to fulfill itself. You are merely the instrument of that fulfillment. The comfort readers find isn't in being told love is easy. The comfort is in having their painful, transformative experiences of love validated as a wholly necessary process.
Okay, so if love is this fire that violently burns away your ego, what happens when two people actually try to live together? Because if love just burns you down, it sounds like you just consume each other until there's nothing left.
Right.
But Gibran offers this incredible counterbalance when the topic immediately shifts to marriage. If love is the fire that burns you, his view of marriage is the structure you build with the ashes. Almitra asks him of marriage next, and his answer is all about creating spaces in togetherness.
This section on marriage is perhaps one of the most famous and most frequently quoted sections of the book. It is read at countless weddings around the world. But the linguistic analysis in our sources highlights how he constructs this argument, which is what gives it its lasting power.
The similes, right?
Yes. He relies heavily on similes and nature imagery to advocate for something quite radical for the 1920s, absolute independence within a marital union. He emphatically does not advocate for two people becoming one indistinguishable, enmeshed blob. He advocates for two distinct, sovereign individuals standing side by side.
I know the quotes, I've heard them read at weddings, but when you really stop and visualize what he's saying, the metaphors are breathtaking. Let's walk through them. He says, let the winds of the heavens dance between you. He compares a marriage to a lute, a stringed instrument. The strings of a lute are completely alone, yet they quiver with the same music.
It's about resonance without losing individuality.
Exactly. And then he uses architecture. He says, the pillars of the temple stand apart. When I read that, the image that popped into my head was a structural arch. Think about how an arch works. If the two sides of an arch just stand straight up, completely parallel, it's just two standalone walls, they don't make a hole. But if they lean in toward each other at the top, they support incredible weight. They can hold up a cathedral.
That's a great visual.
But the absolute key to the physics of an arch is that their bases must remain planted firmly apart. If you try to slide the bases together so they are touching, the entire structure crashes down. They have to stand apart to support each other.
That is a phenomenal modern analogy, and it captures Gibran's exact mechanical meaning. He finishes that thought with nature.
Yeah.
The oak tree and the cypress grow not in each other's shadow.
Yeah.
The underlying philosophy here is that true, sustainable companionship requires individual autonomy. The sources point out that this is a fierce argument against possession and control in relationships. If you try to possess your partner, if you try to merge so completely that there is no space, no mystery, no independence between you, you suffocate the very love that brought you together.
You literally kill it.
Exactly. The moving sea between the shores of your souls needs room to actually move. It's a profound respect for the individual journey of your partner, even when you have agreed to walk a shared path.
It's so healthy, especially for the 1920s, when marriage was often viewed legally and culturally as ownership. And if you think his view on marriage is radical in its insistence on preserving individual space, wait until you hear his view on parenting.
Oh, this part is amazing.
He takes that concept of letting go and turns the dial up to 11. After the discussion on marriage, a woman holding a baby steps forward and asks him to speak of children, and his opening line is a massive paradigm shift. He says, your children are not your children. They're the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself.
This is a direct, unapologetic challenge to the deeply ingrained concept of children as property or as mere extensions of the parents' egos. The expert analysis of this section breaks down the central, extended metaphor Gibran uses, which is archery.
Archery?
Yes, he introduces this vivid imagery. He says to the parents, you are the bows from which your children as living arrows are sent forth. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might that his arrows may go swift and far.
It's a brilliant way to explain the mechanism of parenting. So let's break down the roles. God, or life, or the universe, is the archer. The parent is just the bow. The child is the arrow. So what is the job of the bow? The bow doesn't own the arrow. The bow doesn't get to decide what target the arrow hits. The only job of the bow is to be stable, to endure the tension of being bent, and to launch the arrow forward into the future.
Correct. And Gibran explicitly states that these arrows are flying into the house of tomorrow, which the parents cannot visit, not even in their dreams.
That is such a stark realization.
It is. He writes that parents can give their children their love, but not their thoughts, because the children have their own thoughts. They belong to a future the parents will never see. Therefore, the role of the parent is not to mold the child into a miniature, compliant version of themselves. Seek not to make them like you, he writes, for life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday.
If you are listening to this right now and you are a parent, this might be the hardest thing in the world to hear. I can't help but apply this to the anxieties we see everywhere in modern parenting. Oh, absolutely.
We have the rise of helicopter parenting, where parents hover over every decision. We have snowplow parenting, where parents rush ahead to clear every obstacle so the child never experiences failure. We try to curate their experiences, pick their careers, manage their social lives. And Gibran is reaching across a century, grabbing us by the shoulders and saying, stop.
Yes.
You do not own your kids. They are not your second chance at life. You are just the launching pad. Your job is to be strong, stable, and let them fly completely away from you. It's terrifying. It is a beautiful, terrifying surrender.
It is a surrender to the relentless flow of life itself. It requires a tremendous amount of faith and humility to accept that your child's destiny is not about you. And this philosophy of finding the divine by surrendering to the act of living carries over directly into his thoughts on daily existence.
Because life isn't just big moments like love and kids. Right. Because after love, marriage, and family, the crowd asks him about the mundane realities of life. A plowman asks him to speak of work. And Gibran does not view the mundane, exhausting tasks of daily labor as a distraction from spiritual growth. He views them as the very vehicle for it.
He elevates the concept of labor to a sacred act. He famously calls work love made visible, which is a beautiful quote. You see it everywhere. But I want to explore the context around it because the context is stark and honestly a little unforgiving.
It definitely is.
He says that if you work with distaste, it is worse than sitting at the door of the temple and begging for alms. He uses this highly visceral imagery for if you bake bread with indifference, you bake a bitter bread that feeds but half man's hunger. If you grudge crushing the grapes, you distill a poison in the wine. So it's not about what your job is, it's about the energy you bring to the doing of it.
Exactly. The physical action itself is secondary to the spiritual intention behind it. He argues that if you weave cloth with threads drawn from your heart, as if your own beloved were going to wear that cloth, you are engaged in a spiritual act. It doesn't matter if you are a master weaver, a marmor, or someone sweeping the floors.
Yeah.
The alienation that so many people feel in modern labor often stems from this disconnect, working purely for survival or material gain without infusing the work with any personal care or love. Gibran insists that work is how we keep pace with the soul of the earth.
Okay, I have to push back on this because applying this to a 1920s agrarian society is one thing, but how does a modern person apply this? What if I work a mind-numbing data entry job? What if I am scanning barcodes at a warehouse for 10 hours a day? Isn't Gibran's advice just romanticized privilege for artisans and artists? How do you bake love into a spreadsheet?
It's a very fair critique, and it's the hardest part of his philosophy to actualize in a corporate or industrialized setting. But the mechanism Gibran is talking about isn't necessarily about the end product. It's about your internal state while performing the action.
Right.
Even in a mundane task, you have a choice in how you apply your attention. Are you resentful, projecting bitterness into the world? Or can you find a quiet dignity in the act of focusing, in providing for your family, in being part of the massive, interconnected machinery of human survival? He is challenging the worker to find the meaning internally, rather than waiting for the job to provide it externally. Because if you do it with bitterness, the only person you are truly poisoning is yourself.
You are distilling poison in your own wine. That makes sense. But keeping pace with the earth, as he calls it, isn't always joyful. We all experience devastating pain. And this brings us to one of the most emotionally resonant and complex sections of the book.
The section on joy and sorrow.
Yes. A woman asks Almustafa to speak of joy and sorrow, and he doesn't treat them as two opposite ends of a spectrum. He doesn't say you should seek joy and avoid sorrow. He says, your joy is your sorrow unmasked. They are completely inseparable.
The imagery he uses here connects right back to that physical world of craftsmanship we were just talking about. He uses two objects as metaphors. He says, is not the cup that holds your wine the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven? And is not the lute that soothes your spirit the very wood that was hollowed with knives?
That imagery is so intense.
Think about the physical violence required to create those objects of joy. The lute that brings you beautiful music had to be violently gouged out and scraped thin by sharp knives. The clay vessel that holds your sweet, celebratory wine had to endure the searing, unimaginable heat of the kiln.
I want to make sure the listener really catches the mechanism of what he's saying here. He's suggesting that you literally cannot have the capacity for deep joy unless sorrow has first hollowed you out. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being with its knives, the more physical space you have inside you to contain joy later on. It's a completely revolutionary way to look at grief.
It changes the entire paradigm of suffering.
It does. Today, we do everything we can to avoid pain. We numb it, we medicate it, we distract ourselves with screens, we push it away. But Gibran is saying that grief is the excavation process. It is the digging of the reservoir for your future happiness. If you numb the hollowing process, your cup remains shallow. He says that when joy and sorrow sit at your board, they alternate. When one is sitting at your table, the other is just asleep on your bed.
It is a profound psychological insight wrapped in incredibly accessible poetic language. It normalizes suffering, not as a punishment from an angry God or as a failure on your part, but as an essential expanding mechanism of the human heart. If you accept this, if you truly believe that sorrow is expanding your capacity for joy, you stop fighting the natural rhythm of your emotional life. You allow the hollowing to happen, trusting what will eventually fill it.
Okay, so up to this point, Gibran has given us this beautifully constructed, highly individualistic philosophy. He's talked about how to survive love, how to maintain identity in marriage, how to launch kids, how to approach a mundane job, and how to process grief. It's all very intimate and personal. But what happens when we scale this up?
Right, because we don't live in a vacuum.
Exactly. The world isn't just individuals sitting alone with their feelings. We live in messy, dark, complicated societies. This brings us to the section on crime and punishment, and I have to warn you, if you are listening to this, this is where Gibran gets incredibly provocative.
Indeed. It is the section that challenges modern legal and moral frameworks the most. When a judge of the city steps forward and asks him to speak of crime and punishment, Gibran introduces a concept of radical interconnectedness that is deeply challenging.
How does he frame it?
He begins by framing the human soul as having multiple facets. He speaks of the God self, which is like the ocean, forever undefiled and pure. But he also speaks of the pygmy self, which is the shapeless, sleepwalking part of human nature that searches in the mist. It is this lower, confused self that commits crime. But Gibran absolutely refuses to isolate the criminal from the community.
He strips away the illusion that criminals are some separate breed of monster. He says to the crowd, "Oftentimes have I heard you speak of one who commits wrong as though he were not one of you, but a stranger unto you and an intruder upon your world." He rejects the idea that a criminal is an anomaly. And here is the metaphor that explains his view. As a single leaf turns not yellow, but with the silent knowledge of the whole tree, so the wrongdoer cannot do wrong without the hidden will of you all.
It is a concept of shared collective guilt. And I use guilt in the spiritual sense, not the legal sense.
Right.
Gibran is arguing that human society is a single, massive, living organism. A crime is not merely an individual failing, it is a symptom of a sickness within the whole tree. The tree provides the soil, the water, the social environment, the economic conditions in which the individual leaf grows. Therefore, the actions of the individual are inextricably linked to the silent knowledge of the collective.
But he pushes this even further, and I'm going to push back on you hard about this because this is highly controversial.
Okay.
He writes, "The murdered is not unaccountable for his own murder, and the robbed is not blameless in being robbed." When I read that today, my immediate reaction is outrage. How do we interpret this without it sounding like blatant offensive victim blaming? If someone kicks down my door and steals my television, Gibran is telling me I am not blameless. That feels incredibly dismissive of trauma. How did his readers reconcile that?
It is a jarring, abrasive statement, and if you read it as a legal statute, it is offensive. But the academic sources urge us to carefully contextualize what Gibran is actually doing here. He's not making a legal argument. He's not saying the victim should go to jail or that the perpetrator shouldn't face consequences.
Okay.
He is making a deeply spiritual, macro-level argument about the human condition. He sees humanity as a single procession walking together. He says the just and the unjust stand together before the sun, even as the black thread and the white are woven together.
So if the black thread breaks, you don't just blame the thread, you have to examine the whole cloth. You have to examine the loom itself.
Precisely. The loom is society. If we apply this to a societal level, he's demanding a brutal, unflinching examination of root causes. If a man is robbed, Gibran is asking the society, including the victim, to look at the systemic inequalities, the greed, the social structures that created the intense desperation of the thief alongside the accumulation of wealth by the robbed.
So it's about complicity in the system.
Yes. He is saying you are all participating in the exact same flawed system. The victim and the perpetrator are bound together in the same societal web. He challenges the judges to weigh the soul of the offender, not just the action. He asks, how do you punish someone whose internal remorse is already greater than their misdeeds?
It's a call to look beyond the surface of the act and into the spiritual disease that caused it, which makes perfect sense when you read his thoughts on man-made laws. Because if society is sick, the rules society writes are going to be sick too. A lawyer asks him about laws, and Gibran just dismantles the entire concept of human jurisprudence.
He really tears it down.
He says, you delight in laying down laws, yet you delight more in breaking them, like children playing by the ocean who build sand towers with constancy and then destroy them with laughter.
It's a wonderful, slightly mocking image. He views human laws as fleeting, subjective, and ultimately illusory. The ocean, in his metaphor, represents eternal time and eternal truth. And the ocean will eventually wash away all human attempts to rigidly define morality with written codes.
They're just sand towers.
Exactly. He points out the deep hypocrisy of those who use laws to enforce their own personal limitations onto others. He describes the cripple who hates dancers, or the ox who loves his heavy yoke and looks at the free-roaming deer and thinks, what a vagrant. To Gibran, people who rely entirely on written laws are standing in the bright sunlight but facing away from the sun. They are only looking at their own shadows on the ground, and they think their dark shadows are the law.
If human laws are just sand towers, and if society is a tangled web of shared guilt, then external rules aren't going to save us. We can't rely on judges or politicians to make us good. The only true compass a person can rely on has to come from within. And here's where it gets really interesting, because Gibran maps out exactly how that internal compass is supposed to work. The priestess asks him about the internal struggle we all face between reason and passion.
Recognizing that the human soul is very often a chaotic battlefield between these two forces. And Gibran's answer provides a masterclass in psychological balance. He doesn't take the stoic route and say you should suppress your passions, nor does he take the hedonistic route and say you should abandon reason. He uses a beautiful nautical metaphor.
The ship metaphor.
Yes. He says that your reason and your passion are the rudder and the sails of your seafaring soul.
Let's break down the mechanics of a sailboat, because this metaphor is perfect. If you just have a rudder, if you are entirely governed by reason, you are a force confining. You can steer, you can point the boat in the right direction, but you have absolutely no power to move. You just sit in the water. But if you just have sails, if you are entirely governed by passion, you are a flame that burns to its own destruction. The wind catches the sails and you rock it forward, but without steering, you'll just crash straight into the rocks.
It's a symbiotic requirement. You need the passion to give you momentum and the reason to give you direction. Gibran says you have to invite them both into your house as equally honored guests. You cannot favor one over the other.
If you're listening to this right now and you're someone who chronically overthinks everything, you are paralyzed by analysis, you make pros and cons lists for every minor decision. Gibran is essentially diagnosing why you feel stuck in your life. You are all rudder and no sails.
That's a great way to put it.
You know exactly where you want to go, but you refuse to let the wild, unpredictable wind of passion actually push you there. Conversely, if you act on every impulse and constantly blow up your life, you need to drop your rudder in the water.
And this internal, self-directed balance is the very core of his view on religion. Remember our earlier discussion about how this book became the sacred text for spirituality without religion in the 1960s?
Yeah, the counterculture movement.
This section is exactly why. When an old priest finally steps forward and asks him to speak of religion, Gibran essentially looks at him and says, "I've been speaking of it this whole time." For Gibran, religion is not a separate compartmentalized section of your life. It's not a building you visit for an hour on Sunday morning. He says your daily life is your temple and your religion.
He has this incredibly sharp line where he says, if you wear your morality like your best garment, you'd be better off naked, because the wind and the sun won't tear holes in your bare skin.
That is a direct attack on performative piety.
Exactly. True spirituality isn't a fancy outfit you put on to look good for your neighbors at church. It's your naked skin. It's who you are when you are baking bread, when you are raising your kids, when you're struggling with your spouse, and when you're grieving. And crucially, he defines the role of the spiritual teacher in a way that strips them of their absolute power. He explicitly says that a teacher doesn't bid you to enter the house of his wisdom. A true teacher only leads you to the threshold of your own mind.
This is a profoundly empowering message. It validates the individual's inner authority. It says that you do not need an institution, a rigid dogma, or a priest acting as an intermediary to connect with the divine. The divine is already inside you.
Right there in the everyday stuff.
Yes. It is in the act of baking bread with love, in giving your children the freedom to fly into the future, in balancing your sails and your rudder, and, perhaps most difficult of all, the divine is in how you face your own pain.
Yes, the pain. Because if you are actually living this open, vulnerable, authentic life without the protective walls of your ego, you are going to get hurt. We talked about joy and sorrow hollowing you out earlier, but when specifically asked about pain itself, Gibran gives us another unforgettable, visceral image. He says pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding.
That's beautiful.
Just as the hard stone of a fruit has to literally crack open so its heart can stand in the sun and grow, you have to experience pain to expand. It's the bitter potion that the physician within you uses to heal your sick self.
Which brings us, inevitably, to the final threshold of human existence. After exploring every facet of the lived human experience, from the violence of love to the independence of marriage, to work, crime, passion, and pain, Almitra steps forward one last time to ask the final question. She asks him of death.
And his answer is so gentle.
It is. Almustafa's teachings on death are perhaps the most comforting in the entire book. He insists that life and death are one, just as the river and the sea are one. Death is not a terrifying end, it's a natural release.
He asks this rhetorical question: what is it to cease breathing but to free the breath from its restless tides, that it may rise and expand and seek God unencumbered? Such a peaceful, expansive image. Dying isn't being trapped in a box, it's standing naked in the wind and melting into the sun.
And this leads right into the conclusion of the book, which reads like a highly cinematic farewell. Evening has finally come. The ship that Almustafa has been waiting 12 years for is ready. He descends the steps of the temple, and the entire population of Orphalese follows him down to the sea. He tells the people that he must go, that he is merely a wanderer, a sea given to the winter wind. But as he stands by the boat, he makes a profound promise to them.
He promises that he will return. He says, "A little while, a moment of rest upon the wind, and another woman shall bear me." It's a clear nod to reincarnation, to the eternal, unbreakable cycle of life, death, and rebirth. He boards the ship, the anchor is weighed, the sails catch the wind, and the people cry out as one voice. And Almitra, the seeress who asked him the very first question about love, stands completely alone on the seawall, watching the ship vanish into the mist until it is gone. It's an incredibly moving, almost mythic ending to the journey.
It completes the arc perfectly. We have traveled through the entire landscape of the human soul, guided by a man who, in real life, felt so deeply alienated from the world, yet somehow managed to articulate its most universal truths. Think about the journey we've tracked today. From the story of a traumatized, thrice alienated immigrant boy in the slums of Boston, struggling with his identity, his imposter syndrome, and his demons, to the creation of a universal masterpiece.
Yeah.
Through his art, Gibran stripped away borders, dogma, and human laws to leave us with just our raw, interconnected humanity.
So what does this all mean for us today? We've gone through the history, the incredible sales numbers, the beautiful metaphors, the challenging philosophy. We've seen how Gibran took the chaos and the pain of his own life and distilled it into this crystal clear water for the rest of the world to drink.
It means that the true value of the prophet lies not in its adherence to academic standards of complexity, or whether modernist critics thought it was good poetry. Its value lies in its profound emotional utility. It's a tool for living. It gives people a vocabulary for their most ineffable feelings, their deepest grief, their most terrifying love, their desire for freedom within a marriage, their anxieties about their children. It survives because it is useful.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering thought. Gibran wrote in this book that a teacher only awakens what is already half asleep in the dawning of your knowledge. He explicitly says he cannot give you wisdom. He can only point to the wisdom you already possess. If millions of people over the last century, from soldiers in trenches to hippies at Woodstock to people reading it right now, have felt so deeply seen, so profoundly understood by this little book, is Almustafa really just a fictional prophet? Or is the prophet actually just a mirror? When you read these words, are you hearing Kahlil Gibran's wisdom, or are you finally, perhaps for the very first time, just listening to yourself? When you wipe away the dust, the face looking back, the face with all the answers is your own. Ponder that as you go about your day.